I want to talk to you about some of the implications that will follow this year, 2015. This is really the great year for addressing climate change. In December, there'll be a meeting in Paris where the nations of the world will decide on a course of action built from the bottom up to start reducing our emissions, reducing our dependency on fossil fuels, and to try to bring some stability to the future of our climate system. I think there's a few important things to say about that meeting. The first is that it's not a very ambitious meeting. It intends to try to keep global temperatures rising no more than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial average. That may not sound like very much, but in a world that's 2 degrees warmer than the present one, there will be no Great Barrier Reef, there will be no Kakadu wetlands. Most of our coastal cities will be under quite serious stress from coastal inundation. It costs up to $1 trillion a year by 2050. It's a different world at 2 degrees. So the agreement's not an ambitious one at that level. Moreover, the statistical basis that they're using to correlate the number of tonnes of carbon pollution that can be put out there with the 2 degree target means that our chances of achieving a 2 degree world are only calculated at 50-50. So if the Paris meeting is a success and we limit carbon pollution to a certain amount, basically what we've done is given us the flick of a coin chance of succeeding to stabilise the climate or not. So it's not a very ambitious meeting. The meeting also comes at the end of a decade of unprecedented emissions growth. Our carbon pollution has been increasing at the worst case scenario rate for the last decade. Last year, we put 44 gigatons of carbon pollution into the atmosphere. A gigaton is a big number, by the way. It's a number with 9 zeros after it. Just to give you a sense of how big it is, if we were to try to take 4 gigatons back, let's see how we might do that. We all know that plants are made of congealed carbon dioxide. They grow from the carbon dioxide in the air. So what would we need to do in terms of using plant product to take 4 gigatons out, given we're putting 44 in? What we need to do is take all of the world's forestry waste, all of the world's agricultural waste, and 100,000 square kilometres planted with a high energy crop like sugarcane, take all of the carbon captured in the plant material therein and somehow sequester it in the ground. That would give us about 4 gigatons back out. Right, so these are world-altering numbers we're talking about here, 44 gigatons per annum. My guess is, and not just mine, but many people in the area, that over the next 35 years out to 2050, we will need to fundamentally change a number of the things we do in order to give us a better than even chance of avoiding more than 2 degrees of warming. In fact, if you calculate if you say we want to achieve 2 degrees, but we want to give ourselves a 75% chance of achieving it rather than a 50-50 chance, then the amount of carbon pollution you can put into the atmosphere is very limited. In fact, at current rates, we would be out of carbon budget, or we'd be out of the allowable quota by 2028. Right? So if things go on as they are, we very soon run out of carbon budget and we blow our chances of staying below 2 degrees. To succeed, we have to really ramp up some of the things that we're already doing, which will have an impact on people. So solar installations, for example, globally, just solar PV, the stuff that's on rooftops everywhere, that will have to quadruple in rate in order to play a fair role in terms of reducing the carbon pollution. Wind farm installations need to just about double. Concentrator solar technologies, they're those wonderful things you see in Spain with the big tower and the molten salt that provide electricity 24/7. They need to go from nothing today to about 11% of world's electricity production by 2050. So the way we use electricity is going to have to change dramatically. But on top of that, because of the scale of the problem, and to put it to you frankly, letting the pollution run away for 10 years is a bit like being diagnosed with a cancer and then leaving it for a while before you go and see the doctor. Right? The chance of a cure, the certainty of consequences all change as you leave it go. So that's the situation we're in. So we need to increase clean energy technologies, everybody knows that. We also need to develop ways to start taking CO2 out of the air, like the example I gave you before of using crop waste, agricultural waste and so forth to capture carbon. Thankfully, the number of opportunities to do this are growing hugely. There are companies now producing carbon negative cement, so for concrete manufacture. At the moment, cement manufacture adds about 4 gigatons of carbon pollution a year. We could be taking that out plus a bit more by changing the way we make cement. One of the big impediments there is that companies that make bridges and so forth, they don't want to necessarily be using a new cement for their bridge that's got to last for a century that hasn't got a track record about how long it's going to last, right? So there's some work to do there in order to make sure those technologies play out into the future and play the role they should. Seaweed farming, another great opportunity, not very widely understood, but seaweed farming, because algae seaweed grows about 60 times faster than the fastest land-based crops, can be used to draw huge amounts of CO2 out of the air and out of the seawater that the things grow in. And if we can find ways of processing that seaweed material, we can be drawing large amounts of CO2 out of the air. The manufacture of plastics from carbon dioxide, frontier industry now, in future, is going to be much, much bigger. So instead of using fossil fuels to make plastics, we use the problem itself. We use the CO2 through innovative processes to make all of the plastics we require. In fact, all of the petrochemical derivatives that we require can all be made out of CO2. But these are industries at the very beginning of their life. Transport is probably the area that's going to be most utterly transformed by this challenge. We can't keep burning gasoline and diesel for transport purposes into the future. The carbon budget tells us we can't do that. We have to electrify our transport systems, and that is well underway. What is not so well understood are the implications of electrification and robotisation of transport, which are already occurring and which will change completely, I think, the shape of our cities, the way we use roads, the way we use public transport infrastructure. Just imagine the difference between an electric vehicle and a petrol-driven vehicle. One of the biggest immediate differences is that the chassis of the vehicle can be very independent from the little bubble that you sit in on top. With a mechanical means of connecting the steering wheel to the road, that's not possible. But when it's all electrified, you can have systems where you could take the chassis off. You want to go four-wheel driving, you just call up on your phone a four-wheel drive chassis, put your little bubble on the top of it, and off you go. With robotisation, and this, we're very close to now to the threshold of driverless electric vehicles being widely accepted on roads. There's a number of trials being done around the world. There won't be any need for parking. These robot cars will simply go around, you'll call one up, it'll come and pick you up. When the vehicle's getting towards the end of its life, it'll drive off to the recycling centre and on the way make a call and order a replica of itself to come back in. These changes are huge for our society. Think of the number of taxi drivers, truck drivers, parking inspectors, traffic police, parking, people who make money from parking. All of that will change in the next decade or two as these new technologies start to penetrate into the market. You might think, oh, well, all of this electrification of transport will mean we'll be burning more coal. That's not the case. We know from modelling done in Germany that if all transport in Germany was electrified today, it would only add about 20% to electricity demand. And that demand, in fact, is already being met, but at particular times of the day. Germany has a huge installation of wind arrays now. The wind blows strongly at night in Germany where no one wants electricity, so there's already a lot going to waste. Electric vehicles will simply soak up that excess demand, store it in their batteries, and in future people will be plugging their houses into their cars to power their lives, because the amount of power you need for transport is far greater than you need for stationary purposes. So these are changes which are being forced and will continue to be forced, first by the dire situation that we're in terms of the climate crisis, the fact that we have already gone a long way down a road towards a world of 2 degrees. No one wants to see that happen. The rapid development of these new technologies will allow us to avoid that, even though we'll probably overshoot the gigatons of carbon that are required to eventually create 2 degrees of warming. By using some of these technologies, we'll pull down the carbon on the other side. When I think about the future in these terms, I think back about the position people would have been in, say, in 1915 rather than 2015, trying to imagine the world of 2050, because that's the position we're in, right? We're in 2015, we're trying to imagine the world of 2050 in the context of this enormous carbon problem we've got. Well, back in 1915, you would have been living in a world of horse-drawn transport, no civil aviation, whatever, a world of empires. Most of the world was still in colonies. Very different system to what we had in 1950. By 1950, we had nuclear power, we had jet aircraft. The empires had gone. It was a totally different world. Communism controlling half of the world's population. So 35 years may seem like a relatively short time, I guess, but the technological, social and other changes that can occur within a period like that are simply enormous. And I'm convinced that the next 35 years are going to bring far larger changes to our society as we start to address climate change than the 35 years between 1915 and 1950. We can see it right across the board. And of course, these technological changes will be complemented and driven even further by social changes. I just want to concentrate on one area of social change that's intimately connected with this problem in my last few minutes, and that is the ownership of electricity, generation, transmission, and retail. You know, I grew up in a world where effectively the electricity assets were owned by the people. In Victoria, there was a thing called the State Electricity Commission. It was set up by the government on behalf of the people to provide electricity to us all. We went through a period where the assets were broken up and privatised, and we ended up with a model where corporations were running effective monopolies or a monopoly position, even though they were often highly regulated. In a market where it was hard to measure what you were getting in return for your dollars. You got your quarterly account, but it was very hard to know how that related to what you'd used. That model is rapidly coming to an end. New technologies, community-owned wind farms, solar PV, are changing the generation of electricity. So for those 1 in 5 Australians who already have solar panels on their roofs, you are now prosumers. You're producers and consumers of electricity, fundamentally changing the nature of the electricity market. Transmission assets are now under huge pressure because with a dwindling base to sell into, they have a fixed cost structure, so they have to push costs up to their fewer remaining customers. That makes them, puts them in a non-tenable economic position. Around the world, we're seeing communities now get together to set up cooperatives to purchase transmission assets. In New Zealand, there's a company based in Auckland that has bought not only electricity transmission assets on behalf of the public, but gas pipelines and fibre optic cables. So if you're a customer of theirs, you're one of the cooperative, 75% owned by members of the public, 25% listed on the stock exchange. You get a very big say in that, and you get a cheque, a dividend cheque, at the end of your time. So transmission assets are being returned to the hands of the people. The movement's going on in Germany, there's more of it in the US too, and we'll see more of it in Australia. Electricity retail. I was just up in Byron Bay over the weekend. There's a group of citizens there who've decided they're going to set up their own electricity retailer. They say the service they get from corporations at the end of the phone as an electricity customer is so appalling, they'll set up their own cooperative to look after people and retail electricity. They're well down the road to doing that. Their cooperative will be set up by towards the end of the year. That's just one aspect of the way we as people are now grabbing our future and saying we want a direct role in running things that businesses have done before. I think we're going to see more and more of this as the climate challenge evolves and as some community leadership has demonstrated in very concrete areas such as electricity generation, distribution and retail. We live in an incredibly changing world. I don't know what it's going to be like in 35 years' time, but I'll tell you two things. I reckon we've got a good chance of beating this climate crisis if we widen the number of tools that we make available to us and we put the money into research development to develop the ones that need development and also allow people to really engage as we are with these community programs. Overall, what will the world be like? I'll leave you just with one thought. I reckon money is going to be less important in 2050 than it is today, and social capital is going to be a hell of a lot more valued. Thank you very much.